And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present you Richard AVEDON.
I can't see you. It's a black void out there. Watching those slides, I realized that my very first model was Swiss. The mother of William Tell. Seems so long ago. I haven't spoken publicly in about 5 years. The last time was in Texas. So when I was shaving, I looked in the mirror and I just let out a scream from what's ahead. My way of working and what I believe to be the thing that triggers me and keeps me going is that I believe in doing more, much, much more than is ever needed, ever asked for. And out of that more, it's possible sometimes to achieve something that you can be not ashamed of. So I'm going to do that tonight, which is going to be terrible for you, because I'm just going to go on and on and on and on, and then we'll have answers, and I hope some questions, and then we'll have anything you want. But because I'm nervous, I thought I would start the evening less spontaneously than I might normally, because I think there's information that I want to get across that I've given a lot of thought to, and I don't tend to do that spontaneously. So there was an exhibition in Paris that came to New York called Vienna in the early 1900s. And it was at the Museum of Modern Art, and it contained the works of Kokoschka and Klimt and Schiele. And they asked me to, thank you. Oh, the reflection? Is that all right? It slides down here. So they asked me to speak on portraiture, because so many of the Viennese paintings of that period were portraits. And this is a lecture that I gave on portraiture. It's a little dense, but maybe it'll be interesting. Portraiture as performance. When I was a boy, my family took great care with our snapshots. We really planned. Excuse me. We made compositions, we dressed up, we posed in front of expensive cars, homes that weren't ours. We borrowed dogs. This is of me and my mother, and some dog. Almost every family picture taken of us when I was young had a different borrowed dog in it. This is my sister with some dog. When she was little, it seemed a necessary fiction that the AVEDONs owned dogs. This is my sister a few years later. When I was looking through the family scrapbook recently, I found 11 different dogs in 1 year. There we were, in front of canopies and Packards with borrowed dogs, and always, forever smiling. All of the photographs in our family album were built on some kind of lie about who we were and revealed a truth about who we wanted to be. When I began to study the portraits of Egon Schiele, I was excited. They seemed to me to be among the highest examples of portraiture without borrowed dogs. So when I began thinking about what I might say today, I thought I would contrast Schiele's candor and complexity with the entire tradition of flattery and lies in portrait making. I've always thought that Rembrandt was the master of empty ennoblement in portraiture, and that he was the most dangerous master of the borrowed dog, simply because he is the most perfect and seductive of painters. So I was preparing to say hard things about Rembrandt, And it just didn't seem like a swift thing to do. And since I had thought I had no other thoughts on the subject, I decided to say no and decline the occasion. Now, you won't believe me, but you must believe me, that what I'm about to tell you is exactly true in every detail. The morning I made up my mind not to speak, I walked from my study into my bedroom. And there was a carpenter there, and he was building bookshelves under my bed because there was no more room anywhere else in the room. And standing there in the window was Rembrandt himself, standing in my bedroom in Rembrandt light. There, holding a hammer, dressed as a carpenter, was the genius himself. And I reached for Kenneth Clark's book on Rembrandt and showed Rembrandt the carpenter the chapter on his self-portraits. The carpenter agreed. He said they were absolutely of him. He said, except this one was when I was younger. I set up my camera and asked him to imitate the drawings of Rembrandt that I'd shown him in a few snapshots. Really, it took 5 minutes. Rembrandt the carpenter acted Rembrandt the painter exactly. It seemed undeniable to me that Rembrandt must have been acting when he made his own self-portraits. It was so clear. Rembrandt was telling me that he was acting when he drew himself. Not just making faces, but that always, throughout his life, working in the full tradition of performance, elaborate costumes, a turban, a beret, a cloak, the rags of a beggar, the golden cloth of a sultan, and someone's dog. Really performing in a very self-conscious way. And then I realized, thanks to Rembrandt the carpenter, that it was precisely this quality of performance that links Rembrandt and Sheila, that links all portraits, but which Sheila took to an inspiring and radical extreme. And that ought to be my real subject, just as it is the real subject of all portraits that interest me. Because portraiture is performance. And like any performance, in the balance of its effects, is good or bad, not natural or unnatural. I can understand being troubled by this idea. Am I speaking too quickly? Okay. That all portraits are lies or performances, because it seems to imply a kind of artifice that conceals the truth about the sitter. But that's not all. The point is that you can't get at the thing itself, the real nature of the sitter, by stripping away the surface. Because this means, quite literally, the surface is all you've got. You can only get beyond the surface by working with the surface. All that you can do is to manipulate that surface, gesture, costume, expression, radically and correctly. And I think Sheila understood this in a unique, profound, and original way. Rather than attempting to abandon the tradition of performing portrait, which is probably impossible anyway, it seems to me that Sheila pushed it to extremes, shattered the form by turning up the volume to a scream. And so what we see in Sheila is a kind of recurring push and pull, first toward pure performance, gesture, stylized behavior, pursued for its own sake, studied for its own sake. Then these kinds of extreme stylizations are preserved in form, but disoriented, taken out of their familiar place, and used to change the nature of what a portrait is. I think this begins with hands and gesture. All portrait artists have to think about what to do with hands. It's not at all that a portrait is a kind of arrested moment in a stream of gesture. Gesture just doesn't proceed in lockstep with thought. On the contrary, gesture in life always follows thought and precedes words. Hello. But if you did hello, you mean something else. It would have a totally different meaning. In a fixed image, there's no possibility of one act informing the other. Nor is gesture in a portrait just pantomime, where you invent the right meaningful gesture. Where the hands go is intimately tied up with the whole expressive quality of design, the graphic rhythm of the image as a whole, as well as its psychological and emotional content. So the first thing one sees in Schiele is this kind of marionette imagery. You remember he did a lot of theater drawings with marionette poses. This kind of laboratory of splayed fingers that seem oblique and purposefully unrevealing. The kind of experiment you do when you try to find some random or chance or unpredictable element to break a stereotyped form. Now, I'm not an art historian, although I seem to be playing one on the stage tonight, but it does seem to me that this new language of hands comes in a large part from Klimt. But in Klimt, the new language of hands seems to be merely decorative. I think of Klimt as one of those artists who are made rather than destroyed by being commissioned to do a portrait. When he's forced to confront Margaret Wittgenstein, he has to include some of her complexity in the picture. And the way Adele Bloch-Bauer's face jars and interrupts the Byzantine surface is very thrilling and rare in his work. When left to his own artistic devices, as in The Kiss, the faces are insipid, just compare them. But in Schiele, this new language of hands really affects things in a very fundamental way. First of all, what started out as pantomime has become part of a larger graphic scheme, a whole new, jagged, spindled rhythm. You see as clearly in his flowers as in his figures. Be the same thing. And then he eventually used apparently aberrant or oblique gestures to create a whole new meaningful language of gesture that for me is much more convincing than the traditional postures. So we go from this to this, beginning in pure marionette theater, ending with an image and gesture to do with intellect. This pulling down of the eye, of thought, that's much truer and more beautiful than to say, to scrape the bottom of the barrel, Rodin's thinker, which always seems stupid to me. Now, the ultimate expression of this kind of performance, extreme stylized behavior, is of course fashion, where everything, the entire body, hair, makeup, fabric, is all used to create a performance. So many portraits in the history of art are fashion portraits, fashion images. I mean, it's not written here, but Goya, Velázquez, I mean, all the court paintings are, in a sense, fashion portraits, fashion images. As in so many Klimts, Schiele understands fashion and seems to have been fascinated by it, as in these, or this. But he also, more excitingly, chose neither to succumb to it nor reject it, but to stand fashion on its head, quite literally. As right here. In the same way that the apparently stylized and abstract language of gesture in the marionette pictures, once controlled, became the means toward a new language of gesture, it seems to me that Schiele never abandoned the theatrical conventions of fashion, but instead intensified these conventions and took them to a new place. I think the masterpiece of this particular and particularly daring aspect of Schiele's work occurs in this picture. In your mind, turn it horizontally, because he's lying on a cot in a jail in prison, but he drew it vertically. It's of himself in a jail cell, here in the extreme of humiliation and pain, imprisoned for the daring and the power of his work. They called him a pornographer. He draws himself in an explosion of form equal to the most extravagant ideal of fashion. No man's garment flows so lyrically in the best of times, let alone the worst. One of the other elements of performance is, of course, the prop. And of course, it's significant that Schiele, in his portraits, for the most part, deprived himself of props and scenery. He used empty backgrounds. They're so spare. As one who is addicted to white backgrounds, it seems odd to me that a gray or tonal background is never described as an empty background. But in a sense, that's correct. A dark background fills, a white background empties. A gray background does seem to refer to something, a sky, a wall, some atmosphere of comfort or reassurance, that a white background doesn't permit. With a tonal background, you're allowed the romance of the face coming out of the dark. I don't think you find portraits with white backgrounds before Sheila. Maybe in drawings, never in paintings, with the possible exception of the white icons of Novgorod. And that, I think, is the point. It's so hard with a white background not to let the graphic element take over. It's so hard to give emotional content to something so completely graphic and potentially caricatural, dominated by that hard, unyielding edge. And that, of course, is the challenge and the importance of it. If you can make it work successfully, it permits people to become symbolic of themselves. You will realize later, when you see some of my portraits against a white background, that I had that problem to deal with, that you have the hard edge, but how do you get past it into the feeling of the inside of the person, soul. All of these things, the new language of gesture, the reversal of fashion, the daring white background, are elements that excite and move me in Sheila's work. But frankly, what really excites me in Sheila's work is what he does with sex. He doesn't paint, as does Klimt, vaginas as flowers and asses as pears. Of all of Sheila's pictures, the one that has come to mean the most to me is this self-portrait, masturbating. It seems to me to be a real revolution in the way we imagine sex and erotic life in art. It brings together two different but deeply related things in a very stirring way. First, it's raw and truthful about sex. It reveals something previously hidden about erotic life in art. But in a more subtle way, it's truthful about the implicit eroticism in all portraiture. I think there's an element of sexuality in all portraiture. The moment you stop to look, you've been picked up. You look in a way you're not allowed to look in life. Is there any situation in life where you can look at the Duchess of Alba for half an hour and not get shot by the Duke? There is a confrontational, erotic quality that I think should underline all portraiture. But this confrontational quality of portraiture is almost never used, so far as I know, in explicitly erotic images. They tend to be always, as in these of Klimt's, voyeuristic rather than confrontational. Sometimes, as in this Wild Day guy I just discovered, just look what's going on. Its voyeurism is raised to the 9th degree. Rather than making sexy images, it seems to me that Sheila begins with the knowledge of the complexity implicit in the sexuality of all portraiture, and then again turns up the volume, as though saying, you want to see? I'll give you something to look at. And my painting will look at you looking at me. Is there an image in art before this of a man masturbating rather than a woman? No. This isn't, after all, a keyhole picture of a man masturbating in the same way that Klimt's pictures are keyhole pictures of women masturbating. It's twice removed, twice distilled. Sheila, engaged in the performance of masturbation, presents it as a performance, as in the various meanings of the French word jouer, to act, to perform, to come. He seems to have understood the erotic nature of all portraiture and been at once excited and revolted by it. For all the high degree of sexuality in his work, there's an interesting lack of sensuality, I think. And all this knowledge about being a portrait painter and about performing this act, about watching himself performing the act and painting himself performing the act, and then looking at the painting he made, seems to me wrapped up in this image. It also seems to me a bad performance, though a radical one. It seems to me that this picture fails as a metaphor from the neck up because of his youthful addiction to sentimentality in his treatment of the face. It's in the face that we see the loneliness of the masturbator. A much more banal thought is in this head than is in the subtlety of the body. This seems to me to limit the picture's power by making masturbation acceptable in art only as a lonely act, instead of a frenzied, complicated, pleasurable, destructive whacking off. Imagine this Sheila head on another Sheila body. Or this. Forgive me, I know I've gone too far. Presuming to say what Sheila should have done or might have done is out of the question. But let me end with a story that may say something about all this: performance, gesture, fashion as performance, and the afterlife of Egon Schiele. In 1979, I had arrived at a point in my own career where I was no longer interested in doing portraits of people who were of power or accomplishment. However, there were three men whose work I admired enormously and whose portraits I wanted to make. The three were Francis Bacon, the painter, Borges, the writer, and Samuel Beckett. My sitting with Francis Bacon was planned for a Sunday morning in Paris. I had set up my outdoor studio in a shady side of the Musée d'Art Moderne at the Trocadero. Bacon arrived. He walked up to the place where I was in a striped shirt, leather pants, check jacket, dressed to kill, dressed to be photographed, and we had a charming conversation about the difference between living in Paris and in London. It was a sunny day and a really lovely, civilized exchange. Then, no, it was. And I began the portrait. I explained the nature of the diptych I wanted to achieve. I made a little sketch of what I hoped to do. I asked him to exchange his jacket for my plain dark sweater, and then I asked him to bring his hand up into the portrait. If I'd asked the same of a politician or a banker, or for that matter, any one of us, the tendency would be for the subject to want to look distinguished, serious, sage, to rest a hand on a chin, or bring a hand to a forehead. Bacon immediately acted out the role of the private Bacon with the greatest purity, economy of gesture, and yet filled with authentic feeling. Without my saying a word, he understood what my portrait was about, what it called for from him, and he still remained true to himself. No one could act Bacon but Bacon. And on this perfect, clear Sunday, facing the Eiffel Tower, he achieved an honorable and perfect performance. Now that I look at the picture again, I see how much this gesture of internal conflict comes out of the modern tradition that Schiele began. I certainly wasn't aware of it at the time, and I very much doubt that Bacon was either, but now I like to think that there we were performing, and there, peeking around the corner, maybe with his new friend Rembrandt, Schiele was pulling the strings. So, now, I feel better that that's out of the way. I'd like to show you a lot of my portraits. They come from different books, and I've done them chronologically. The first book was published in 1959 and was made up mostly of actors and artists and cinematographers. This is a picture of Charlie Chaplin. I tried to photograph him for 2 years. I wrote to him, I never got an answer. And one day the phone rang in my studio. This goes back to I don't know anymore, 57, something like that. Phone rang and a voice said, "This is Charles Chaplin." And I said, "And this is President Roosevelt." And I hung up. Then the phone rang again, and it said, "This really is Charles Chaplin. Do you still want to take my picture?" And I said, "Yes," you know. And I sent everybody out of the studio. Is it wine?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm hiding it. It's in the picture. So I felt that for me to impose my young and just beginning talent on this genius would be really hubris and uncalled for. I thought, by the way, Chaplin never posed for, except once, for a still picture where he wasn't in character. He was always photographed as the tramp or Monsieur Verdoux or whatever role he was playing. So there was a Steichen picture maybe 30 years before in a studio, and that was it. So it was a big moment, it was a big occasion. And he walked in, I was a wreck. I was much more nervous than I am tonight. And he said a fantastic thing. He looked at me and he said, "We're just about the same height." And it was so wonderful because all my friends were tall and jocks like Casper Fleischman. And I always thought I'm just not tall enough. But when he said that, I knew I was tall enough. And I did a picture as simply as I could, just his face, because I thought, record what Chaplin looks like on this day. And when I was done, he said, "Are you finished?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Could I do something for you?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "Are you ready?" And he put his head down out of the camera, and he came up frowning furiously with these horns. Then he said, "No, no, I want to do it again." He went down, and he came up smiling. And that was it. I took the pictures, and then we sat and talked about his movies, and he stayed, and he stayed, and he stayed, and we talked and had a wonderful afternoon. I couldn't believe it. And the next morning, the headlines of the newspaper, you probably remember that Chaplin came to Switzerland, that there was trouble in America of all kinds. He had hidden in my studio and gotten onto a boat and was out beyond the limits of the government or the press, and this was his actual last message to America. I can't take responsibility for that picture. It's one of those moments when the light is right and you're there, and it's a gift. This is René Clair. And this is John Huston and Hitchcock. I loved actors when I was young. I sort of moved from actors to directors to people at the end of later in my career, to emotion that was real, not performed. This is Marian Anderson. Look at her face. She was a great American soprano. And later on in the evening, I'll say, these are the daughters of the American Revolution. And those women banned her from singing in Washington because she was black. George Brock and his wife. And before the bad times, Marilyn and Arthur Miller. This is Chanel, a woman who breathed the air of Korea and success and a fighter. Marcel Duchamp. Jean Cocteau eating a lily or breathing on it. Cousteau. I always love the gums in that picture because it looks like a shark. Like he turning into a fish. This is Anna Magnani. It's a great story about Anna Magnani. She was in New York in a hotel room, suite, and I was allowed to set my background up near the window in her living room. And she was like an hour or two late. And I was sitting there. And then she came out of the bedroom in her taffeta evening coat from the night before with nothing on underneath it, and all these crease lines from her pillow. She'd been sleeping up until that minute. And she came out and she said, "You want me to be myself or somebody else?" I'm glad I said yourself. And this is a little bit interesting. Bardot, you saw this picture before. Bardot had very dyed hair, so it was very brassy and hard. And it made her look hard and kind of cheap. And in the darkroom, working with a wonderful man who had been the assistant of Baron de Meyer, he showed me a trick that I didn't know. Can you see what it is? We printed the hair double. In other words, we printed the hair, then we shook the enlarger so it would blur, but covered her face, so that her face isn't blurred, but the hair is, which makes it look very soft and beautiful. This is a series of men who were great American vaudeville comics, like of the time of Buster Keaton in the theater, some on the screen. His name was Bobby Clark. Louis Armstrong. I didn't know how sick he was when I did that picture. No, seriously, he died soon after. And that's Buster Keaton. And this is Burt Large. Do you remember from The Wizard of Oz, the Cowardly Lion? And he's playing in Waiting for Godot, which is the only serious role he ever played. And he was tremendous in it. And Jimmy Durante, another American master. And this is a poetess. There's something interesting. No, it's going too far afield. Never mind. I was going to talk about layout of that page, but we'd be here really till tomorrow. This is Ezra Pound, the day he was released from the mental institution in Virginia. He was hiding out at a poet's house in New Jersey, and I did the sitting with him. Somerset Maugham. Isaac Dinninson. I'll tell you a story about Isaac Dinninson. She's a great writer, as you know, and I worshipped her work, and particularly out of Africa. And we met in a hotel room in Copenhagen, I think. And she came in this big fox coat, looking just like that, and she said, "I judge people by what they think of King Lear." I was sort of 29, and I wasn't going to try that on. It never occurred to me what a disgusting thing that was to say to anybody. Who was she to judge anyone, and why would she set the terms? So, I mean, I judge people by how they behave. But doesn't stop her from being a great writer. And look at that, look at the electricity and the facets in that face and the vitality at that age. As you know, she was very sick. Now we go into my next book, which is called Nothing Personal. It's about the civil rights movement in America. It was my attempt to create a polemic that I had a certain audience of people who read Harper's Bazaar, and I thought I could convince them of my feelings about civil rights. Well, they didn't buy this book. There's something called remaindered, which means they mark the price down to nothing and get rid of them. So a lot of students who already were for the civil rights movement got this book for almost nothing. And I think some of my best work in it and some of my worst work is in it. And I'll explain why when I get to it. This I like. It's a sort of metaphoric picture for the way in which a certain class of white America was not concerned about the civil rights movement and the civil rights of anybody. This man is balding, his stomach is falling, and he's building sandcastles. It's not a bad metaphor for today. Now, then I did a section on weddings at City Hall, when people have the illusion that absolutely at that moment, weddings and certain occasions, everything's going to be wonderful, everything's going to be solved. And you can tell by now I'm not such an optimist. So you're kind of revealing, like that picture, do you know what a maiden form bra is? I mean, the bosom is lifted. Just look at that picture. They've got everything. They've got their shawls, their hats, their orchids, their men, and each other. Oh, this is very funny. Barbara, can you hear me? There's a great model of mine is in the audience tonight, Barbara Mullen. And you've seen her pictures in the fashion section. And I was doing the weddings, and no one knew who I was. I just went to them and said, I'm doing a book, and I want to do some pictures after the wedding in City Hall. Will you pose? And they would say yes or no. But this girl knew I was a fashion photographer, and she was a model. So the whole wedding was ruined. All she could do was think about she was going to be posing for Richard Avedon. And the poor husband is saying, look at her. She's giving me her best smile on the day of her wedding. Looks like an Italian wedding. And I love this one, because that's obviously her son from a previous marriage, right? Now, this begins, you'll see a few of the pictures I don't like, because as I said in the Sheila piece, the danger of caricature when you do this kind of work is very, I mean, I wanted to be funny about the weddings, but the racist people in the South, like Governor Wallace and Leander Perez, these are people who mean nothing, but all right, these are the daughters of the American Revolution. That means that every one of their ancestors came over on the Mayflower, or original people who come to America. And they turned into the most conservative of organizations. And they're the ones who wouldn't permit Marian Anderson to sing in their hall, whatever they controlled. That's what I mean by caricature. I think it weakens the portrait to make a joke of him in that way. And the same with Wallace. And Baldwin, who wrote the text for this, said, but they are caricatures. And I don't believe that about anybody. You know, I think it's more complicated. These are these teenage rock stars of the 50s, the Everly Brothers and Fabian. And you saw that before. He's Killer Joe Pirro, and he taught the Kennedys and everybody how to do the twist. He was a dance teacher. And that's Joe Louis's fist, his left. And these are two civil rights workers. That's Wallace. This is Malcolm X. That was Martin Luther King III. And then a little boy, he's now a politician, yes, in Atlanta. And at that moment, he couldn't get into a school. Only the schools were all segregated. And his father was making an issue of it. And he's turned into a political figure in the South now. The man on the left was a man actually born in slavery. He was 106 and had his childhood as a slave. And that's Dorothy Parker, an American writer, and Marilyn later. And these are pictures that I did in a mental institution. They're sort of metaphors for the pain of the black people, even though many of them are white. It's just about pain and also the thin line between sanity and insanity. Now, this is a little group of 3 optimistic pictures, because the writer who worked with me, James Baldwin, felt that the book needed an optimistic end. And he wrote an absolutely beautiful text, and I want to read just 2 paragraphs. He said, "For nothing is fixed. Forever and forever and forever it is always not fixed. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down the rock. Generations do not cease to be born. And we are responsible to them because they are the only witnesses, we are the only witnesses they have. The sea rises, the light fails, lovers cling to each other, and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out." Now, a series from a book called Portraits, done during the Vietnamese War. This is a big example of my doing too much. I worked all over America, did thousands of pictures of the anti-war movement. Then I went to jail, came out of jail, decided I can't finish this book. I had enough for 3 books. But I have to go to Vietnam, and I did. And while I was there, I don't know if I can tell this story or not. I'll try. If this story fails, you maybe will understand. I just kept working and working and working, and I came back with thousands of pictures and only published 1, which you'll see later. It's of a group of men called the Mission Council. They were the people who ran the war in Saigon for America. Ambassador Bunker, General Abrams, the head of the CIA, the head of public relations for the war, the head of economics. And I not only came back with that picture, but I came back with an intestinal infection, diarrhea, in other words. And that went on for a year. I was down to 55 kilos, and I was going lower. So I thought it was time for another opinion. And I went to another doctor at another hospital, and the doctor said, "Well, we need 2 weeks of your stool." And I thought, 2 weeks? So but I didn't know what to do, so I got a tin can, and then do you know the ice packs that you get to put around caviar? I got a lot of those. You put them in the freezer, take them out, and I put the 1 tin can in the other tin can, and I began to collect my stool. So it was August, and it's very nice to go to the beach, the ocean, on the weekend. So I would carry my stool, my pails to the beach. I would take my pails back from the beach. Finally, the 2 weeks were over. I changed my ice packs, and you can't ask, one man can't ask another man to carry a shit for him. So I said, I'm going to New York Hospital with this gift. And I took it to New York Hospital to the nurse. And she said, "What's that?" I said, "That's 2 weeks of my stool. It's what the doctor wanted." She said, "He didn't mean all of it." And I think that has a lot to do with what it is to be an artist, what it is to be a writer, what it is to examine, to collect, to hold on to what everybody else throws away, what any healthy person would want to get rid of as quickly as possible, to examine it in the hope of making things better, in the hope of finding out what's wrong. Okay. So these are some portraits when I began to work with an 8x10 camera, the larger format camera. Truman Capote, Jean Genet, an art dealer, Casper. This is my mentor and my teacher. His name was Alexei Brodovich, and he was a brilliant Russian who redesigned Harper's Bazaar and taught me. And I would never have achieved what I have without him. He's dead now. But look at the elegance of the way he holds that cigarette holder. I'll tell you a quick story. I took all his classes. He taught his whole life, as well as was the art director of Harper's Bazaar. And one of the classes was in graphics and design. And the assignment was to do a neon sign for Times Square. And after the class, I went over, and his head was always down. And I always called him Mr. Brodovich, even, you know, when I had worked for him for many, many, many years with him. And I said, Mr. Brodovich, I'm a photographer. I can't design a neon sign. And his head was down. Could I have another assignment? And he said, why not to use spaghetti? And I thought, that's it. If you can't do it one way, do it another way. Use spaghetti, get some pipe cleaners. And I never looked back from that. Was the lesson of my life. If you can't solve a problem one way, you solve it another way. And he taught that way. That's very obliquely. He was a wonderful man. Jasper Johns. Gabriel Marquez. Now, I'm sorry it's small. That's the Mission Council. There are 3 pictures, very, very large in scale. That's 35 feet long and 9 feet tall. And there were 3 that represented that period. This is the pro-war group that I described, the government representatives. These are the Chicago 7 who were against the war and were tried in Chicago. I'm sure you know about them. Abby Hoffman and Tom Hayden, many. And this was the Warhol factory. This was the sexual revolution that went on at that time. These were all the people. See, Warhol is way over on the right, and those are all the people he made his movies of. It was a big breakthrough at that time. And then he's a dress designer who dressed Mrs. Reagan, named Galanos. And he lives across the street from my studio. He's a chef. And Buckminster Fuller, who's all brain. And Borges, the Argentinian writer. This is the last portrait done of Stravinsky. And it was amazing because he was in a wheelchair. And he sat like the first picture, just like that. He'd had a stroke. And he had been photographed so much in his life that when I was ready, I took the first picture, and then I saw these eyes begin to lift. I took the second picture, and then all the force of that mind came right through into the lens in the third one. So I decided to keep them together because it's so wonderful about someone who's inside of himself coming out. Vladimir Horowitz. A poetess named Muriel Rukeyser. William Burroughs. And a Swiss man, Robert Frank, great photographer. And the woman he lives with, maybe his wife, is June Leaf. It's one of my favorite portraits I ever did of a woman. She's so generous with herself. These were done in Hollywood. They're of film directors. That was John Ford. This is Groucho Marx. And Oscar Levant. Do you remember American in Paris? He was a wit and a very complicated man, as you can see. Now, this is the beginning. All the pictures up to now have been very subjective. I've put my feelings into the pictures. But this was an issue of Rolling Stone in the election year, 78, I think, I'm not sure. And I was photographing the power structure of America. That meant the heads of unions, the people in government, the bankers, the heads of media. It was a picture, a composite portrait of they call the power elite. Now, remember this picture of Henry Kissinger because I'm going to talk about it later. But I decided it would be very cheap shots. I didn't feel anything for these people. I didn't want to say I'm a Democrat, they're Republicans. So in a way, these pictures, and some of them are just amazing, are taken by the people in the picture. I didn't tell them what to wear. I didn't tell them how to put their hands. However they presented themselves, I recorded with very little manipulation. This is George Meany, who was a great union head. Nelson Rockefeller. It's interesting to look at these faces and compare them to the Western pictures that I'll show later. That's one of our presidents, Jimmy Carter. Well, they come and go. This was before he was president. And he also was, at that time, the head of the CIA. And Humphrey, who was a great Democrat. Muskie, senator. Eugene McCarthy also ran for president. This is a wonderful man named Roger Baldwin, lawyer. He founded the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, and they defend, free of charge, even guilty people. Everyone has a right to legal defense in the country, and this organization devotes its time and its energies and brilliant work keeping the law for people who can't afford very often to have good lawyers. He was at 90 years old when I did that. And this is Cesar Chavez, who was a union head for field workers in the Southwest, formed a union for them. And these are at the time that I did these two pictures, the last two living Kennedys. I'm going to read a little something now. It's about, again, about portraiture. I once went to Washington for what they call in Washington a photo opportunity. It was with Henry Kissinger. And as I led him to the camera, he said, "Be kind to me." I wish there had been time to ask him what he meant, although I think I know. His anxiety speaks to all of my own deepest questions about the nature of photographic portraiture. What was he thinking? Did he want to look thinner, younger? Was he hoping that I would permit the best that was in him to burn through? Or could he have wished, as I would have if I were being photographed, that being kind would have to do with the recognition of something more complicated? My anger, fragility, strength, vanity. The pictures that moved me most as a young man were Cameron's portraits of Herschel and Carlyle, Nadar's of his wife, the Baron de Mayas or Marchesa Casati, all of them formal, even stylized, none of them candid. But what's wonderful about them is that they're not addicted to the perfect surface of things. What is kindness? What is a compliment? It's trivializing and demeaning to make someone look wise, noble, which is easy to do, or even conventionally beautiful. Beauty can be as isolating as genius, but with no lasting rewards. When the thing itself is so much crazier, contradictory, and therefore fascinating. I guess it's because you can't define it exactly, that you can never come to the end of it. That's why I keep doing portraits. But if this kind of candor is what any ambitious portrait photographer is after, I suspect it can only be achieved through contrivance. And it's in trying to direct the traffic between artifice and candor without being run over that I'm confronted with the questions about photography that matter most to me. What is the function of a portrait? What degree of manipulation is correct between the sitter and the photographer? And is correctness of any concern in art? Is it of more concern in photography? If I reveal that the portraits in the American West were of actors, meticulously cast, would it diminish or enhance them as works of art? Do photographic portraits have different responsibilities to the sitter than portraits in paint or prose? And if they seem to, is this a fact or misunderstanding about the nature of photography? It's an ambiguous and unresolved situation, the mystery between reporting and storytelling. There is something about the nature of photography that makes this shifting experience more intense, almost hallucinatory, in the way in which it switches back and forth between reality and fiction. My camera and I, together we have the power to confer or to take away. Now when I go to a museum, the photographs seem to have little to do with me. They have a life of their own, like the actors in Pirandello, or if you saw The Purple Rose of Cairo. They have confrontations with their viewers. And I, who was the photographer, have become a viewer. They embrace us or accuse us through the wonder and terror of being a photograph. So, how about an intermission? Can you bring the lights up? Curt Truninger, who introduced me, is a director, and he has a team of cinematographers, and he may come around and ask you questions. Oh, yes. I'll see you in 15 minutes, maybe?
Once again, I see that photography can be art. What impressed me, for example, is that in his fashion pictures are perfect mise en scène and the capturing of motion and aesthetic. On the other hand, in his portraits, the characters of the personalities come alive. He never needs any requisites, like a chair or a table. And I think that's interesting, because the people he portraits really speak for themselves.
As a black man, of course, I loved his picture of Beverly Johnson, who became the first black lady ever to appear on the cover of Vogue. And this picture meant so much to Black America. Do you believe that it hung in so many households from Harlem down to the Deep South?
Many of the models and most of the models who worked with him realized that we were working with someone of immense talent, if not bordering on genius, because he was more than a photographer, really. I mean, for us, it wasn't just a camera clicking. It was a wonderful experience. It was a wonderful kind of sharing with this man. He was marvelous, that's all I can tell you. He was just simply wonderful to work with. I mean, I was never particularly pretty, but I could move, and one day I came in and I'd had a fight with my lover, and I was crying, and I looked dreadful, and Dick said, "It's all right, it's okay." I said, "Don't worry." He said, "It's all right," and he photographed me that way with another model. I looked sad, she looked beautiful, and the photograph was great.
I was particularly impressed by the way Richard Avedon was able to relate to his audience in this talk. The way that he was able to make fairly complex themes like portraiture in European painting and photography understandable to a lay audience. He really relates well to the people listening to him. He came across as a very strong realist, I thought. I mean, the way he took his fashion photography out of the usual scenes and put it back in the everyday world, the way he manages to get beneath the skin in his portrait photography of celebrities. And I'm really curious now to see what he does in the second half of the talk with the American West photographs.
Now there they are. These sisters ran a big wheat farm, but they were also the presidents and vice presidents of the Loretta Lynn fan club. They created this, they devoted their lives to Loretta, they slept in the same room with 3 little beds that they had as little girls, they never married. They ran this farm in full makeup every morning. They'd put their makeup on and they'd go out, and I was fascinated with them because they're sort of pioneer women. He's a drifter. When I use the word drifter as a caption for these pictures, it's not because these men like drifting. It was a period in America when I started working where the recession out west wasn't spoken of, and no one sort of talked about it. And these men were going from place to place looking for jobs. He's an out-of-work ranch hand. It was the time when the iron business, the mining went down. Butte, Montana, which is the biggest copper mine in America, the whole town folded, the pit closed, ranches folded, agriculture was in terrible trouble, and these people worked very, very hard. This is a factory worker and her niece. Coal miner, whose father and brother died in the coal mine that he worked in. And I said, "Why are you working here?" He said, "Well, I went in to see what it was like, and that's where they were, and that's where I am." It's very strange how lives sort of form of jail for people. He couldn't get out with his whole family dead. This is an Indian. If you look very closely in the lower right hand, you can see he's holding something. It's a $10 bill. He wouldn't pose unless he was paid. And also, I always gave money to the people who were in trouble. But he wanted it first. And she came to a rodeo with 2 young men, about 20, 21. And I asked her if she'd pose, because I thought she had a remarkably positive and powerful, wonderful face. And I said, she introduced me to the men. She said, "This is my son, and this is my lover, who was 21. And I said, "Well, what shall I say you are?" In the caption, she said, "Housewife." Now, if you look closely, this picture is taken by Laura. Can you see the man with a knapsack on his back? He's a drifter. And we pulled up the car, and I spoke to him and asked him if I could take his photograph. He said yes. Now, this is an interesting picture because you see that my arms are in the same position as his? It's something I wasn't aware of, but I learned from Laura's pictures, that I very often imitate who I'm photographing so that I can feel what they feel. I mean, are they holding on to themselves? Are they feeling strong? It's a physical, tactile thing for me. And I was very surprised to see that picture because I had no idea that I did that. And there are many pictures like that. Now, we were in a gasoline station and put up the white paper. And there I'm tucking his shirt, helping him to tuck his shirt, indicating that I want his shirt tucked in. And here's the portrait. I did a great many young people. She's one. It's amazing. Look at her. That's what she looked like. But I sort of saw a Botticelli in her, and I think it comes out in the picture. In the young people, I was looking for what they would turn into, so that you could see in their youth the direction their lives would take. This was Good Friday, Easter weekend, so that's, I think, why she wore the lace. It's funny, when I look at these, I remember stories about every single one of them. I remember every moment. I don't about the early fashion pictures. It's been so long. This is my introduction to the book. Beginning in the spring of 1979, I spent the summer months traveling in the West, going to truck stops, stockyards, walking through the crowds at a fair, looking for faces I wanted to photograph. The structure of the project was clear to me almost from the start, and each new portrait had to find its way into that structure. As the work progressed, the portraits themselves began to reveal connections of all kinds between the people: psychological, sociological, physical, familial, among people who had never met. This is how these portraits were made. I photographed my subject against a sheet of white paper about 9 feet wide and 7 feet long that is secured to a wall, a building, sometimes the side of a trailer. I work in the shade because the sunshine creates shadows, highlights, accents on a surface that seems to tell you where to look. I want the source of light to be invisible so as to neutralize its role in the appearance of things. I use an 8x10 view camera on a tripod, not unlike the camera used by Curtis, Brady, or Sander, except for the speed of the shutter in the film. I stand next to the camera, not behind it, several inches to the left of the lens and about 4 feet from the subject. As I work, I must imagine the picture I am taking because I don't look through the camera. I never see precisely what the film records until the print is made. I'm close enough to touch the subject, and there is nothing between us except what happens as we observe one another during the making of the portrait. This exchange involves manipulations, submissions, assumptions are reached and acted upon that could seldom be made with impunity in ordinary life. A portrait photographer depends upon another person to complete his picture. The subject imagined, which is in a sense is me, must be discovered in someone else, willing to take part in a fiction he cannot possibly know about. My concerns are not his. We have separate ambitions for the image. His need to plead his case probably goes as deep as my need to plead mine, but the control is with me. A portrait is not a likeness. The moment an emotion or fact is transformed into a photograph, it is no longer a fact, but an opinion. There is no such thing as inaccuracy in a photograph. All photographs are accurate. None of them is the truth. The first part of the sitting is a learning process for the subject and for me. I have to decide upon the correct placement of the camera, its precise distance from the subject, the distribution of the space around the figure, the height of the lens. At the same time, I am observing how he moves, reacts, expressions that cross his face, so that in making the portrait, I can heighten through instruction what he does naturally, how he is. The subject must become familiar with the fact that during the sitting, he cannot shift his weight, can hardly move at all, without going out of focus or changing his position in the space. He has to learn to relate to me and the lens as if we were one and the same, and to accept the degree of discipline and concentration involved. In other words, those two women have been talking to me and then holding their expression, move their eyes over to the lens. As the sitting goes on, he begins to understand what I'm responding to in him and finds his own way of dealing with that knowledge. The process has a rhythm that is punctuated by the click of the shutter and my assistants changing the plates of film after each exposure. There are times when I speak and times when I do not. Times when I react too strongly and destroy the tension that is the photograph. These disciplines, these strategies, this silent theater attempt to achieve an illusion that everything embodied in the photograph simply happened, that the person in the portrait was always there, was never told to stand there, was never encouraged to hide his hands, and in the end, was not even in the presence of a photographer. I'm sorry you can't see these original prints. These slides are so dull and the prints are so excellent. I say that because I work with a team of great printers. These are a few patients in a mental institution in the West. I do mental institutions and certain underprivileged people so that we pay attention, so that we know that they're there and how, you know, that in every family there's trouble. Here we are on the ceiling, the roof of a jail. I was doing a diptych of two prisoners. You see my little Polaroids on the wall on the left? And I'm trying to match a picture I did 4 months before. See, I did the one on the left, and then I spent 4 months in jails in the West looking for a man to go with the man on the left. And it was amazing when I found the same scars, the same face. You know, there's even, I don't know if you can see it, a scar on the cheek of both men. They were both, by the way, murderers. Now, this is interesting. I saw an amazing-looking oil worker. He looked like an El Greco. He didn't want to pose. So I had to think very quickly. The thing about photography is it's very athletic. If you can't make it happen, it's gone. It never happens again. So I asked his friend to pose. I wasn't interested in the friend at all. And you see the one I'm interested in is in the left, watching. Then I said, why don't you get in the picture with your friend? And he did. But the friend still looks like an idiot, right? Then I went in and I said, look, why don't you move over here and why don't you get out? And then I had the man I wanted who would not pose to begin with. And that's my portrait of him. Thank you. There we're just horsing around. It's so funny, isn't it? He looks Elizabethan. He's wearing a see-through shirt, and he's this lug. It's the fashion of that summer in Colorado. Someone asked me in Winter Tour the other night about why I cut the child's head off, a bottom of her head. And it was deliberate to show how many children are born that aren't wanted and there's not enough money to care for them properly and they're just there by chance. This is interesting. She's a Mexican woman who comes across from Mexico to work in, right across the Rio Grande, in factories that make blue jeans and clothes. And they're very inexpensive labor. And it's a sort of Mexican Hispanic tradition. I can't remember the name of the town, that on your birthday, the factory gives you a corsage and a couple of $20 bills. Then all your friends pin money on. And if you're well-liked, as she obviously was, you get this enormous corsage of money. And I thought it was a very good metaphor for why everyone came to America to begin with and still comes to America. And I like that picture for that reason. I went back to some of the coal mines or certain places year after year to perfect the work. And the miners, well, of course, they were curious as to what I was doing. So my first exhibition of this work was on the wall of the coal mine. And they came out from underground to see these pictures of themselves done the year before or season before. They didn't say much about them. I never knew what they thought, really. I love, this was taken before the one you just saw, and they just sort of stood at a distance first, as if and this is interesting because those are my drawings of what I want to do before I do the sitting. Compositions. I think up at the top is a triptych that's coming later. The interesting thing about these pictures, I had a very strong feeling, more so than the oil workers, of sympathy for these men who chose to go underground, who chose to go into the black and live and spend their working lives a mile down in the earth. And the printing was black on black on black. All these, it's like, I mean, I thought of the Black Goyas as a kind of inspiration for myself. But to print those shades of black, which you can't see here, with every detail showing, took sometimes weeks to make one print. This, I'm sorry I don't have 3 slides here to show you, but this picture presented a very serious problem. It was a very loving father. He swung his daughter upside down and she was laughing. Then she was like this. That was the second exposure. The third exposure, she turned her head and put her finger in her mouth, and the fourth exposure, she cried. And immediately he picked her up. The great photograph is her crying, because it's a picture of cruelty. It's a picture of this little girl's going to be upside down her whole life. But I couldn't, there's a moral issue here. You have to be able to stand behind the image you show. For instance, I've never shown the atrocity pictures that I did in Vietnam, because I have this feeling that those kind of pictures add to the sum of violence in the world. I don't think watching horror does what it's intended to do. Thank you. Now, the last 2 pictures are very contrived, whereas the pictures you've seen up to now are of people as they stand. This is obviously worked on very hard by me. As a matter of fact, there were 3 sittings in 2 days, in this case and in the case that follows, to make the snake look like a liar, to make it a mythical picture, to show a boy who's just at that moment when the feminine part of himself is disappearing and the man in him is coming out. He's got a man's eyes, but these soft, and even his hair is male and female. And what I wanted to do, it comes clearer in this. This is a picture completely of the imagination. This never happened. I dreamt it, or I didn't dream it, but it's the way, I thought of it the way a painter would think of what he wanted to paint. Then I advertised in beekeepers' journals. I asked anyone who was willing to have bees on their body. send me a Polaroid. I got many Polaroids. And then I finally got one from this man, Ronald Fisher, who said, I know I don't look like what you want, but I'd be willing to do this. I am a beekeeper. I also work in a bank. And I called him in a minute. He was in Chicago. And I brought him out west. And I also, to achieve this picture, my reason was, if you remember that in the text, I said that all the pictures are fictional. And I wanted within the book and within the body of work to say, look, this is as true as that. John Wayne's West is as true as my West, or not true. It just was a secret thing for me. It wasn't explained in the book. But I felt that it was necessary. And there were two pictures in the end with bees and Ronald. One was what I called a kind of Christian picture. He was martyred. You felt his suffering from the stings of bees. And then there was the one in which he simply, this one, removed himself, more of a Buddhist image. And the fact that the people of this class out there accept the stings of bees, accept their lives so stoically is what this picture is about to me. But I mean, it isn't necessarily to anyone else. So here's Ronald. And between Ronald and myself is the head of entomology at the University of California, who came out with his bees, and he's about to put the fluid of the queen bee onto Ronald's body, and I'm showing him, just go down, I'm going to crop there, and then the bees, when they came, would settle on the part where the fluid was. And Ronald, we really got bit. And there were times when tears were coming out of his eyes, and he'd have to wait until the tears went away. You know, bees don't sting you unless you touch them, unless they feel they're attacked. And they don't know, for instance, if a bee gets in your armpit and you just flex your muscle a little bit, he'll bite. If you don't move at all, he won't. Or she won't, I don't know. It's he, I guess. So the whole discipline was not to, if it was in your ear, which sounded like a jet, you just had to be very still and wait till he left your ear. As my book, Portraits, was being completed, there were certain artists whose work had affected me, whom I had not photographed. And one of these was Jean Renoir, the great film director. Renoir lived in Beverly Hills, and I went to him. His home looked like everything I'd always thought a home should be. It looked like south of France. It didn't look like Beverly Hills. There were flowers in and out of the rooms and sunshine coming through the windows and a long table in the middle of the room. A long table at the center of a house has always had great meaning for me. When I arrived, I was shown to his bedroom. He was naked, being helped to dress, completely unembarrassed by my presence. He was old and quite sick at that time, and he walked with difficulty with a walker. There was something so moving about his face and about his life and his work and what he stood for. He was one of the last people I felt in awe of. When the sitting was over, in those days I worked with incredible intensity. I mean, my heart would pound out of control while I was photographing. Renoir said, "Won't you join us?" So I sat at the table, and some friends arrived with vodka and a sundae cake, and Renoir sat down. Behind him was a portrait of him by his father as a child, and the potteries he had made himself as a child, guided by his father. A young Czechoslovakian director who was there visiting started to talk with Renoir about film with a capital F. What happened to me used to happen to me very often. I froze. I couldn't speak or think. I felt inadequate. I thought, what can I say or contribute to anything that happens at this table? Well, actually, nothing so grand was happening, but I considered myself very good at disguising my feelings, and I knew there was no necessity for me to speak. I could legitimately be a quiet person, but I was paralyzed inside. Smiling, trying to appear comfortable, thinking, what right do I have to be at his table? I came to do my photograph. I should leave. I'm not a friend of the Renoirs. This is Sunday. Renoir stood to go to the bathroom, and I used that occasion to say goodbye to everyone. As I walked to the front door, he came out of his bedroom with his walker, which sort of blocked my way. It was a narrow hall, and we were stuck there in this confrontation. I extended my hand and said, "Mr. Renoir, thank you very much for allowing me to photograph you." And he looked into my eyes and spoke, and I'll never forget his words. "It's not what is said that matters. It's the feelings that cross the table." Well, I froze my face, and I walked to the car, and I wept. Imagine a man in his 80s, sick as he was, knowing what was happening at the table, and to care, and to say it. Well, that's my kind of standard for human behavior. To be able to be that present in each moment, the quality of paying attention that he had, and then the compassion. I think there's not much more to life than that story. To be that age, surrounded by your father's works of art, to have created your own, and to live in a house with sunshine falling through the windows, and a wife, and a jar of vodka with spirals of lemon rind in it, and friends, and your own son who has become a teacher, and his children sitting with the grown-ups on Sunday, and to still pay that kind of attention to a stranger. I'd like to show you some portraits I did of my father at the end of his life, the last 7 years of his life. I think I photograph what I'm afraid of. Can we bring the lights up?